Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. If you are new, welcome. I am Jay and we are on case number 14. If you haven't watched any of the previous 13 cases, check them out if you have the time. I have gone over quite a few interesting cases within the last couple of months, but I am back with an unsolved case today. This is a case where if it had happened on any other day, it more than likely would have been solved. But this man was murdered on the same day as the 2,996 victims of the 9/11 terrorist attacks in 2001. He is known as the last person murdered on 9/11, even though his murder doesn't have anything to do with the terrorist attacks that occurred on that fateful day. I will add up my disclaimer now. With all unsolved cases, it's always frustrating not knowing any answers to what happened to the victim, so be prepared for that agitation. But let's go ahead and get started on today's case. This is the unsolved murder of Henryk Siwiak. Henryk was born in Krakow, Poland in 1955. He did live the majority of his life in Poland. He grew up with his sister Lucinda, who says as a child he was full of energy and was very passionate about learning in school. Henryk especially had a passion for science and read everything he could get his hands on within that field. He later married his wife Iwa and they had 2 children together, a daughter named Gabriella and a son named Adam. According to his wife, Henryk was an incredibly hardworking man. He wanted to give his family everything and wanted nothing more but for them to live a wonderful life and be happy together. Iwa would recall how devoted Henryk was to their family. He adored spending time with their children, teaching them how to ride their bikes or teaching them how to play chess. Henryk was also a restless man with constant determination. He was always on the go and he always strived to make sure that his family was comfortable and they had enough money to live off of. He worked as an inspector for Polish state railways for a few years, but in the year 2000, Henryk would be laid off from this job. Although Iwa still held her job as a science school teacher, her position didn't pay enough to cover all the bills. During this time in Poland, the economy wasn't at its greatest. The unemployment rate was way up and it was extremely difficult for Henryk to find another job. By October of the year 2000, Henryk, who was still desperately searching for work, decided to travel to the United States, where his sister Lucinda had been living for the past 6 years. Henryk believed he would be able to find work more easily in the States, so he packed up and made the decision to leave his wife and children in their home in Poland, and he would travel to New York to live with his sister in Queens. Once he arrived in New York, things were still difficult for Henryk. He unfortunately didn't have a work permit, and he also didn't speak English very well at all. Despite these obstacles, Henryk was able to find odd jobs to work in. He worked every single hour that he could. It didn't matter to him if it was day shift, overnight shift. It didn't matter how many hours he worked in a day or which days of the week he worked. He was open to every opportunity that presented itself to him. He also didn't particularly care what type of job it was. He did anything that was available. Henryk knew that he had to work whenever possible so he could support his wife and 2 kids back in Poland. He sent all the money he could to them and kept very little for himself. As months passed, Henryk was still having a very difficult time learning English. He did attend classes and his sister Lucinda would try to help him learn by watching TV shows together, but Henryk continued to struggle learning the language. Lucinda was worried about him not knowing the English language well. She knew that living in New York wasn't the safest place to live in, and she frequently worried about his well-being. She constantly told him how dangerous the city was, especially if you weren't able to speak or understand English very well. But Henryk continued to press on and he pretty much ignored his sister's worries. His main focus was earning enough money so he could return back to Poland and build a new house for him and his family. Throughout the year of 2001, Henryk was making a pretty steady income working for a construction site in Lower Manhattan. His children were growing up. His daughter was 17 and his son was 10 years old in the year 2001. Henryk made sure to contact his family every single day as they were always the most important part of his life. And he was very well on his way conquering the dreams he had for himself and his family. He just had to reach his goal money-wise before he could return back to his home in Poland. But sadly, he would never get to go back to his home alive, and he never got to see his wife or his kids again. Henryk had been living in New York for about 11 months on the day of September 11th, 2001. It started out as a normal day for everyone, including Henryk. He was already at his construction job downtown that morning, and he was one of the several people who watched when the first plane crashed into the North Tower at 8:46 a.m. Henryk, along with thousands of others, were forced to evacuate the area and were immediately sent home. Henryk was slowly making his way back to his apartment in Queens when the second plane crashed into the South Tower. The news about these planes crashing into the Twin Towers, as a lot of us remember, was broadcasted everywhere. It didn't matter where in the world you were located. You turned on a TV and it was the first thing that you saw on the news. Every single firefighter, officer, and first responder headed to the horrific scene, attempting to help every person within the chaos that they could. Thousands of people lost their lives in an instant. Hundreds of thousands of people across the globe watched in horror as the buildings continued to burn. The citizens who were trapped towards the top of the building had no way to escape. These citizens who were trapped had to make the impossible choice: either wait and be killed by the flames and the destruction of the building, or jump from the top of the World Trade Center. Nobody but the people who were there in New York that day could ever understand the fear and the chaos that erupted. Back in Poland, Iwa had also learned about the attacks, and of course, she was immediately worried about Henryk, and she desperately waited to get in contact with her husband. Henryk and Iwa had just celebrated their 20-year wedding anniversary 6 days prior on September the 5th. And finally, her worry faded when Henryk called her that early afternoon to let her know that he was safe and okay. Iwa remembers that during the phone call she had with Henryk, he didn't fully understand what exactly had been going on, because his TV happened to be out of order, and remember, he didn't understand English very well. So he really didn't understand the full extent of what was going on. His wife begged Henryk to stay home and not to go back out until the situation had settled. And Henryk agreed with her, and he was like, okay, I won't. He pretty much just dismissed his wife's worry about the whole situation. But after he got off the phone with her, Henryk did leave. He immediately went out looking for more work. He had actually found an ad in the Polish language newspaper about a job for a cleaning service that was available, and he left straight to the employment agency to fill out the paperwork so he would be able to work this job later that same night. Henryk was beyond determined. In his mind, he couldn't afford to miss a single day's worth of pay, and despite the entire city basically being shut down, he was still able to find another job that he could work that same day. He made it to this agency and secured his job for the cleaning service and was scheduled to work at midnight cleaning a local Pathmark supermarket. Henryk was instructed to meet a man at 1525 Albany Avenue in Farragut, Brooklyn. With a few hours available before his shift started that night, Henryk headed back to his apartment, and when it was time for him to leave to this cleaning job, he got dressed in his camouflage pants and matching coat. He packed his backpack with an extra pair of shoes and pants. He then asked his landlady from his building, whose name was Anna Sadowska, for directions. She helped him write down the directions on a map, but she mistakenly gave Henryk directions on the opposite end of Albany Avenue that he was supposed to go to, but neither one of them knew this at the time. Henryk then took a 90-minute subway ride towards his destination, but instead of getting off on the south end where he needed to be to get to the Pathmark supermarket, he got off at the north end at approximately 11 p.m., and he was about 3 miles away from the supermarket. Henryk very shortly after this found himself lost, and he was still walking north instead of south due to the incorrect map directions. Henryk was not familiar with the area, and he kept heading down the wrong way. Henryk did ask a couple of people for directions, but due to his poor English skills, the directions that he did manage to get from people were of no help to him. He soon found himself in a very dangerous neighborhood. Henryk had stumbled right into Decatur Street, which was a very bad neighborhood during this time, even in normal circumstances. This area was known for constant drug and gang violence. The locals knew that this was a place you did not want to be in after sunset. The people a part of this neighborhood did not take kindly to strangers, and unfortunately, that's exactly what Henryk Siwiak was. He was a stranger, and he was lost and alone in this dangerous neighborhood. And like I said, this neighborhood was considered dangerous on a normal day in New York. But on this day, on September 11th, the morning terrorist attacks that occurred ignited fear and paranoia in every single citizen. It is unclear as exactly what happened to Henryk Siwiak verbatim, but a couple of witnesses in the area remember seeing Henryk in his camouflage outfit being followed by a small group of men. At roughly 11:40 p.m., many residents recall hearing a couple of men arguing with each other, but most of them were too scared to look out their windows to see what was going on. Then at 11:42 p.m., 7 gunshots were fired right outside of 119 Decatur Street. 6 out of the 7 shots missed entirely, but 1 shot hit Henryk in the chest, entering his lung. Henryk staggered his way, leaving a trail of blood behind him after getting shot. He did manage to climb the steps of the 119 Decatur residence. He rang the door's buzzer and banged on the door, pleading for help. but the resident who had just heard several gunshots refused to open the door, fearing that whoever had been shooting would fire at them if they opened it. Henrik, who was bleeding profusely, stumbled back down the stairs, and he collapsed face down onto the street. 911 was immediately called to the scene, but due to every investigator already focusing on trying to find survivors from the terrorist attacks that morning, only one detective came to the scene where Henrik was shot. The very few officers and ambulances that were able to come to the scene did come within minutes, but Henryk Siwiak was pronounced dead at the scene. Normally in a homicide investigation, the crime scene unit would secure the area and focus on finding forensic evidence. But the crime scene unit was not available as they were also assisting in the area where the World Trade Center was located. Instead, for the investigation of Henrik's murder, one person from the evidence collection team, who normally responded to things such as burglaries, not homicides, was sent to secure the area and help the one detective that was at the scene. The NYPD claimed that they did what they could that day, but being so severely understaffed and with limited resources, it was impossible to tell if every piece of evidence had in fact been collected that night. The little evidence they were able to recover were the shell casings of a .40 caliber handgun. It was confirmed the shooter shot at Henrik 7 times, with only one bullet actually hitting him. They also recovered $75 from within Henrik's wallet, which prompted investigators to believe that robbery most likely had not been the motive behind the shooting, as the shooter did not steal the money Henrik had in his possession. The backpack Henrik had carried with him also appeared untouched, with the extra shoes and pants still in the bag, but the investigators could not, with 100% certainty, confirm if there had been anything else in this backpack or if Henrik had anything else on him that was worth stealing. The one bullet that struck Henrik was still embedded within his chest. The investigators attempted to link the shell casings found to any other crime within the area, but they were unable to link these specific shell casings to any other crime. For the next couple of days, the investigators would attempt to talk to the residents on Decatur Street to see if anyone had actually witnessed the shooting, but everyone claimed that they had only heard the gunshots and did not see the shooting actually occur. If someone had seen what had happened to Henrik, they never came forward to provide the investigators with any information. There were no security cameras in the neighborhood at the time, so the investigators' only hope were potential eyewitnesses. I don't know if anyone had actually witnessed Henrik's murder or not. People were terrified that day. I believe that most people probably didn't peek through their windows that night, but now it's been 2 decades since Henrik has been murdered, and yet no one has ever come out and claimed to have witnessed the actual shooting from that night. Only a couple of individuals have claimed to even see the alleged group that had been following Henrik on that street, and even those people couldn't give any specific details on what these men looked like. A woman named Mona Miller, that lived just one door away from where the shooting occurred, stated, quote, "I heard a couple of men talking, arguing, and I heard a shot. I don't know if I heard a shot or a couple of shots, but I didn't come to the window because I don't dare come to the window," close quote. Another witness by the name of Sharoni Perry was one of the only people who claimed to have seen men following Henrik that night. She claims that she saw a total of 3 men who looked as if they were following Henrik down the road. She also claimed that although she did not see the shooting take place, she did also hear the gunshots, and when she looked out towards the direction of the shots, she saw the men scatter away from the scene. The police briefly considered the theory that Henrik's murder had been part of some sort of gang member initiation, but they never found any evidence to back this theory up. Sadly, as days, weeks, months, and now years have passed, investigators are no closer to solving Henrik's murder. It's unfortunate that due to the timing of his murder being on the same day as thousands of others were killed by the terrorist attacks, Henrik's murder was pushed aside. His murder received very little, if any, media coverage at all, and the little coverage that was done took at least a month after September 11th. It makes sense that this murder was severely overshadowed by the 9/11 terrorist attacks. It doesn't make it right, but it's definitely also not surprising to say the least. I truly believe if Henrik had been killed on any other day, there's no question that his murder would have been so much more thoroughly investigated than it was. The NYPD has even admitted to this. Henrik's sister Lucinda and his wife Ewa have developed their own theory on what happened to Henrik that night. They believe that the shooter or shooters may have thought that Henrik himself was a terrorist. They think that him being dressed in camouflage that night, and along with his darker complexion and obvious foreign accent, may have contributed to him being shot that night. as maybe the person who shot him feared he was part of the terrorist militia that caused the Twin Tower attack earlier that day. Fear and anger can make people do crazy and terrible things to another person. And I think their theory on what happened to Henrik is very possible. He was definitely at the wrong place at the very worst time. But since investigators are unable to prove this either, this is just another possible theory. This case is considered a cold case today, and not one suspect has ever been identified for this case. 9/11 is undeniably one of the most horrific U.S. tragedies that has ever been committed. So many people have been affected by this day. So many innocent lives were lost. And I do not downgrade this horrific event by any means. My sincerest condolences to everyone who has been affected by the terrorist attacks on 9/11, directly or indirectly. No one knows why tragedies like this occur. Thousands of people continue to suffer the grief that 9/11 has caused. But as for the case of Henryk Siwiak, it to this day remains the only unsolved murder that occurred on September 11th, 2001. Henrik's family still do not have any answers to what happened to him. I wanted to share this case and Henrik's story because it's still not talked enough. 2 decades have gone by and it still feels like his murder is still being overshadowed. I hope one day I can make an update video for his case. The investigators who continue to work on Henrik's case have hope that someone who was there that night had witnessed his murder, and they have hope that that person will come forward one day. If anyone has any information, please come forward. Henrik's family deserve answers on what happened to him. They deserve to know the truth, and the person or people that caused his death deserve to be prosecuted. Henryk Siwiak deserves justice just like every other victim. But unfortunately, that is all I have on this case. Don't forget to like, share, and hit that subscribe button, and I will be back with case number 15 in a few days. But until then, bye guys.